As you noted, 5 of the best minds on this issue are on the stage tonight. But since there are 7 of us here, your job over the next hour is figure out which 2 do not belong on that list. Angela Glover-Blackwell is founder and CEO of PolicyLink, an organization that advocates for low-income families and communities, and which has built a really remarkable collection of data about the racial and ethnic gaps in income and education around the country. I urge you all to take a look at it. She's a former senior vice president at the Rockefeller Foundation and co-author of the book, Uncommon Common Ground. David Frum is my colleague, a senior editor at The Atlantic, the author of 8 books, and a former speechwriter for George W. Bush. Next to David is Heather McGhee. She is president of Demos, a public policy organization that also focuses on economic and political equality and has done really some top-notch work on college debt and affordability. She's a contributor to MSNBC, a member of the World Economic Forum. Welcome. Jim Wallis, president and founder of Sojourners, a nonprofit organization which describes its mission as putting faith into action for social justice. He has written 10 books and teaches at Georgetown University. The other side of Jim is Michael Gerson, a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post and nearly 100 other papers, a senior advisor at ONE, the international anti-poverty organization founded by Bono, among others, and a former policy advisor and speechwriter for George W. Bush, who, among other things, coined the memorable phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations, many years ago. And on the other side, Grover Norquist, president and founder of Americans for Tax Reform, a longtime conservative strategist, and the author of 3 books. The name on the title on the door says we're here to talk about inequality and the 2016 election. But I want to start by kind of asking you all to define what the problem is. What should be our core concern? Is it reducing inequality, which is the top pulling away from everybody else? Or is our core concern increasing upward mobility, which is increasing the odds that people born on the lower rungs of the income ladder can climb to a higher level, especially a higher level than their parents reach? Are those the same goals? Do we apply the same tools to each? Is solving those problems compatible, incompatible? Angela, start us off.
We have to solve them both, because part of the reason that so many people are being left behind and it's so hard for people to move up the economic ladder is because so much wealth is concentrated at the top. And the process by which that wealth gets concentrated leaves those who are at the bottom falling away. And so you can't separate those problems. I think the American people are really feeling the way that they are suffering at the bottom, and that looks like an enemy you can point to. But I don't think that we have disaggregated the problem enough for people to understand the relationship, but there is a relationship.
David? I'm going to concur. Ron, I think that's a fantastic and very powerful question. There are actually 3 trends which we group together. The 2 you mentioned, the increase of wealth at the top and the difficulty in mobility at the bottom. There's also stagnation of wages at the middle. I don't think these things have the same cause, necessarily. It's quite easy to imagine, they're all happening at once now, but in the 1980s, for example, and 90s, you had fairly rapid increase at the middle and even faster growth at the top, a rise in inequality consistent with improving middle-class income. You could imagine a society where all the groups in society were moving upward at the same rapid trajectory, and yet there would be no mobility in that case because people they're all moving at the same pace. And the consequences of these problems are different. The concentration of wealth presents political problems. How does a democracy flourish when a few people have much more political power than others? The stagnation at the middle is an economic problem. That is where the great bulk of American investing, saving, and consuming takes place. And the stagnation, the difficulty of rising at the bottom is a social problem because it belies the promise of American life.
That is, I think, the question. It's going to be the question that sort of shapes the ideological debate, actually. And I agree with both of you that they are deeply interconnected because the economy is not the weather. Inequality is not something that has happened naturally. It has been the result of a series of policy choices. And it happens to be that where we are now is that on virtually every single economic and social policy, we have continued to make choices that have left us in a place where we neither have mobility nor opportunity, and we actually have just an incredible concentration of wealth at the top. So, for example, I'll just give one example. You can say, let's leave the top tax rates where they are because we don't want to punish the wealthy for being wealthy. But then you don't have enough revenue to do things like universal pre-K or make college affordable to all again. These things are actually deeply related. And of course, you can look within an enterprise. Are you going to spend $6.5 billion on share buybacks? for yourself as a CEO and your shareholders who themselves are concentrated among the wealthy, or are you going to translate that $6.5 billion into pay for your lowest paid workers?
Jim.
Well, I agree with that. I just want to pick up on something our opening speaker said, the accident of birth. To widen the conversation a bit, June 17th, we saw at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston that African Americans, black people in this country aren't safe anywhere in this country, even in their own churches at a Wednesday night prayer meeting. That's a whole different kind of inequality that has to be part of this conversation here. And I'll just say, inequality is part of human life, right? But when it becomes so massive, like it has now, it becomes not just an economic issue, it becomes a moral issue, and I would say it becomes a religious issue. And so when it is so wide what separates us, it affects our quality of life in every single way, not just the economy, but our sense of who we are, our belonging, our sense of being part of a society. This is a very deep spiritual issue as well as an economic one.
Can I just follow for a question, going back to something David said? Would inequality still be a problem if there was robust mobility? No, for Jim. Would inequality still be a moral challenge if there was still robust mobility? If people were getting ahead, but people at the top are getting ahead faster, would that still be a concern, a distinct concern?
The comments that I heard here, I agree with. The way that inequality is structured, it makes robust mobility less and less possible. Mm-hmm. That's the problem.
Okay. Mike?
I guess I'd approach it slightly differently. I think Americans have a high tolerance for inequality, given our history, our tradition of freedom. But inequality, in the absence of mobility, is a caste system in which birth equals destiny. So, and becomes unjust and becomes inconsistent with the American ideal. And we're seeing some very good recent description of why that's happened. And it's not just encompassed by one ideological perspective. Bob Putnam, who's been at a variety of events here, describes the collapse of the blue-collar economy because of globalization and technology. He describes the atomization of communities that fail to provide essentially assistant parents in a variety of ways, and the unprecedented decline of family. And then he talks about how all three are related to one another. And they create a circumstance in which we have a self-perpetuating class structure.
Grover?
Yeah, the recent decision to focus on inequality stems from a political tendency that doesn't want to talk about 50 years of a war on poverty not working. So, we got a new problem. And we have a real problem because the economic growth from during this recession recovery, the recovery began 6 months into Obama's term. It's the weakest recovery since the 1960s recoveries. Had we recovered in terms of jobs at Reagan's rate, there'd be 12 million more people working today. That's 12 million people with jobs, that's 12 million families, that's a lot of economic growth, that's a lot of opportunity, 12 million, that aren't there today because certain decisions were made which made those not happen. It's 6 million below the average. So Reagan had a strong recovery, but it's 6 million below the average recovery since the 1960s. So when you take 6 or 12 million jobs away, you do a lot of damage. You don't want to talk to people about the damage you did to their opportunities, so instead you say, hey, that guy has something that I took away from you.
Do you think there is there a problem with either of those trends? Is inequality or mobility on its own terms? Is there an issue on either of those fronts at this point, you think?
Well, if you had economic growth, you'd have more mobility. There are things the government does that limits mobility, and we need to deal with that. I mean, in the late 50s, early 60s, 5% of American jobs required some government permission, some license, doctors, lawyers. It's now 30%. People want to braid hair. People want to, mow lawns. Want to be a taxi driver. Okay, the government's put all sorts of stops in front of those job opportunities. They've cartelized them. They've set up guilds, something we thought we got rid of in the 1400s, and those things stop opportunity.
So Heather, let me ask you, because you said that policy choices have been critical in both of these problems. On the other hand, you could look at the last 15 years and say, when George Bush left office, the median income was lower than when he arrived, which was almost unprecedented in a two-term president. The median income is now lower than when Barack Obama arrived. We've seen the median income decline under a Republican president with Republican policies. We've seen the median income decline under a Democratic president with Democratic policies. There are people who look at that and say, we are looking at a global problem having to do with globalization of labor, technology, other issues, more than we are the specific policy choices. What do you make of the fact that we've had both parties now, 15 years where the median income is lower than it was?
So that's a great question. That's where I love that Demos is a nonpartisan organization, because I can say that even with Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, the general cast of our economic policies have been redistributive upwards. So yes, it is true that globalization and technological change have been mega trends for all of my lifetime, and yet those have been mega trends in Denmark and Germany, where they have ordered the rules of globalization and technological change with an eye to the median, with an eye to economic security. So they take for granted that the economy is going to be much more flexible, and in fact, people are going to lose their jobs because we want businesses to be dynamic enough to lay people off when needed. But there's an entire wraparound of economic security producing policies. Only 1 out of every 4 unemployed workers is actually, 1 out of every 4 workers is actually eligible for unemployment insurance in this country. And you see that under Democratic and Republican presidents, we just have not had the will at the state, local, and congressional level to really take seriously the economic insecurity facing most families and have a more robust government response.
David, I'm interested in your thoughts on this question. You know, as we've lived through this period where the median income is lower now than it was 14 years ago, it was almost unprecedented in American history. And although many individuals are still better off, obviously, than they were personally 14 years ago, Rob Shapiro, the economist, has done research saying even that has enormously slowed down in the course of individuals' lives. So when you look at that, to what extent do you think it is a function of choices that each party has made, or are there dynamics here that neither party has an answer to?
Or are there dynamics on which both parties agree? Both parties agreed, for example, to maintain a very open-door immigration policy. We often talk about inequality as if the decision to admit 40 million people since 1970, most of them very poor and unskilled, that doesn't have a lot to do with the hardening of poverty at the bottom of the American income distribution. I think it does, and as if it hasn't exerted downward pressure on wages. I think on a lot of the issues, and through the 90s, there was broad willingness to take more risks with economic and especially financial deregulation that set us up for the back-to-back financial crisis of the dot-com bust at the beginning of the 2000s, which now, it doesn't show up a lot in the statistics, but for the experience of many middle-class savers, it was a catastrophic event. When you look not at the value of the stock market, but at the presence of people in it, movements in by individuals in and out of the markets, that for many people, 2000 and 2001 were just as devastating as the events of 2008. And in fact, many of those people then said, well, I'm never going to make that mistake again. I'm going to take what remains of my savings and put it someplace safe. I'm going to buy a big house and take out a mortgage, and that's going to be the way to build my equity. And a lot of people went through that double crisis. There are real differences between the parties, but I think one of the things in a forum like this that might be useful to do is to examine the commonalities.
Yeah, and we will. And I'm going to come back. Let's park the immigration point, because I was going to bring that up later, and we'll kind of address that as a group. But let me ask Grover. Let me ask you, because you focused on the paucity of the recovery, the weakness of the recovery. On the other hand, the 8 years of W. Bush, there were 1.2 million jobs over 8 years, compared to, 15, 60 million under Reagan, 22 million under Clinton. So we've had a long period of slow job growth and slow income growth, or actual decline. Is there anything there that kind of goes beyond the economic policy of any individual administration?
Well, you have to look at the Bush administration. It was 8 years. First 2 years, you had Democratic Senate, or 18 months of that, and the last 2 years you had Democratic Senate. Those were the periods where you had the economic problems. Congress is a lot more, because the policy mattered. I'm sorry, in 1983, we cut the capital gains tax, we cut the caps on dividends, and you had strong economic growth for 4 years when you actually had the policies that Bush was trying to put forward. They were also trying unsuccessfully, and I don't think they focused on enough to deal with Fannie and Freddie. People said 8 years, 10 years, 12 years earlier, this is going to collapse. Surprise, it did. Government can't run banks very well. And so you had those problems. But you had 3 different periods of economic policy. Democrats ran the House and the Senate for the last 2 years of the administration. That's when you had massive even worse spending issues and worse tax policy. So you can't look at a president, it's like Clinton. The first 2 years of Clinton, the economy was pretty flat. Last 6 years, it was pretty strong. Something happened. The House and the Senate changed, and the policy changed. Congress is a lot more important in terms of control than the president on a lot of these policies.
Final thought in this area, and then we'll move on. Angela, your thought about whether either party has an agenda that is commensurate with the size of the challenge of broadly raising living standards again.
No, neither has. We have an economy that has been restructured. We have businesses that are all about profit. We don't have a safety net, and we don't have a strategy to be able to retrain and get people into jobs. And when people are in jobs, they don't have the protection to be able to have the salaries that they need. That is a perfect storm for inequality, and that is exactly what we're getting. And we have not been able, through any administration, to be able to muster the political and the public will to be able to say, we have to do something different. We have to have a different structure for the economy that actually values people. And we have to have government playing the role that it has to play to feed the economy and to make sure that when the economy fails, we can capture people.
Jim, you want to?
The commonality of the parties, there's even a deeper issue there, which is the stat 1% have made 95% of the economic growth since the recession. Part of it is who they are, who they're with all the time, what normality is. When a senator tells me he has to raise $20,000 per day, average to be reelected, both political parties are deeply embedded in that 1% themselves. So it's what normality is, who you see every day, who your friends are, who you talk to. I mean, coming out here, in line, we're all asking for upgrades, right? Mm-hmm. Frequent flyer is a kind of an example of what's happening in the whole society. The whole society is kind of a frequent flyer club where you get upgraded all the time, and the more miles you have, the more money you make, the more you get upgraded. And people get used to that as a way of life. And we don't know, the woman who worked 3 shifts at Dunkin' Donuts, 3 different stores, drove her car between all 3 of them, slept in the car between shifts. It was an old car, and so it was cold one night, and she kept the motor running. She was asphyxiated, sleeping in her car, waiting to get into her 3rd Dunkin' job. So when people who are running the society don't even know people like her, you don't really think about this.
Mike, let's finish this section with a quote from a column you wrote this spring, which was a fascinating column. And you wrote that while both parties are talking more about upward mobility, neither really had their heart entirely in it. And this is what you wrote. You said, both parties are led along different routes to talk about mobility and equality of opportunity. This embrace is largely rhetorical. When Democrats refer to stalled mobility, they are generally still talking about inequality. When Republicans embrace mobility, they often mean cutting taxes and reducing regulations.
Yeah, I think that we have had an increase in the rhetoric of mobility, particularly compared to 4 years ago. If you look on the Republican side, we had candidates that were all jockeying to look the most like Ronald Reagan the last time around, if you remember. Mm-hmm. Now we have at least 3 candidates. You had Rick Perry today talking about race and poverty issues. You have Jeb Bush. You've got Marco Rubio, who supported the shutdown in 2013, is now an innovator on policy. But so there's a difference, but I do think it's largely rhetorical, but as a former speechwriter, I don't want to say merely rhetorical, because rhetoric can be the peg on which you hang policy. That's what you always hoped as a speechwriter, is you get candidates to talk about these issues, and then you fill in the policy. But it's tough. Going back to what others were saying, we have fundamental problems, declining institutions, blue-collar economy, families, communities. And beside those things, a lot of our solutions look pretty pathetic. Yeah. When it comes to that part of the book, you describe the problem. Bob Putnam has this problem in his book. Right. And then you come to the chapter on solutions, and they look minuscule compared to the scale of our problem.
Do you think home visitation under the ACA is not sufficient to the parenting? gap that he
it's
describes?
actually pretty good.
Yeah.
There's good evidence on that.
Right.
But
it's a positive. It's a positive, but it's not.
The
Right.
scale is just not even.
David, I want to move on, but you go ahead
I'll
real
be
quick.
very quick with this one point, because it's important, again, not to conflate what we mean by upward mobility and what's happening in the middle. Let me offer a choice between two societies. One in which conditions remain very stagnant for most people, but the occasional person of extraordinary talent born into the bottom 15% of society is able to leap out and rise much higher. Or a society where maybe there's a little bit less mobility, but where the average person working in a steady way sees at the end of their career that they're better than at the beginning. I think those are different things. And the second is probably more important to more people. So do not be too transfixed by how do we escape from poverty for some, to the detriment of the question of how to ensure a steadily rising standard of living for most, because most of us are pretty average, and the average person matters.
Let me move on to chapter 3, at least in my how I'm thinking about this. And I'll start with Angela, and I'd like Grover to weigh in also. To the extent we worry about either reducing inequality or improving upward mobility, is the goal primarily one of fairness? Is it that we are not living up to our founding principles, that anyone can go as far as their talent can take them? Or, particularly as we transition through this historic moment of greater diversity in the country, where this year was the first year ever where a majority of our K-12 public school system is now kids of color. As we go through this diversity, is the case for a more inclusive economy fundamentally that a more evenly distributed opportunity makes the economy work better? Does greater equity depend primarily on a moral case or an economic case at this point?
We have gotten to a point where it is both. What we need is just and fair inclusion. As we become a nation in which the majority will be people of color very soon, and already all those under 5 are of color.
As of last week they announced.
By 2019, the majority of all under 18 will be of color. Making sure that those groups that are being disproportionately left behind, Latinos, Native Americans, African Americans, while it'll always be a moral imperative, has also become an economic imperative. If people of color representing the future do not do well, the nation does not do well. And so fairness and justice have come together, and they have come together at a time in which the economy is going to benefit and the democracy will benefit. Because if we can get democracy right in the context of all of this diversity, that will be something you'll want to stand on the world stage and be proud of. So the moment is here, but it is going to take a lot of change, because the way that we're going, the people who are coming now trying to get in have found doors that are shut, windows that are shut, no pathways in. We've got to fix that.
Grover, I think I'm asking you, what is the chicken or the egg? Because you said before that, one reason we're having trouble with mobility is that the economy is not growing fast enough and not creating enough jobs. There are those who argue...
move somewhere with mobility. You got to go to something.
There are those who argue the opposite, right? Also, that one of the reasons we're not growing is because income is so concentrated, and that the economy would actually work better, would produce better outcomes overall if income was more evenly distributed and more people had spending capacity.
No, look, what we want is fairness, and that is opportunity. Everyone should have the opportunity to do well. The government right now, if you want to, what should the government do? Start by undoing the things that get in the way. All of these licensing laws, the way we treat ex-felons, and eliminate them through all of these licensing laws from opportunities. And the tax and spending policies. The reason why people who talk about opportunity also, like Paul Ryan, talk about reducing marginal tax rates and other things, is that's part of what it takes to create economic growth. We've seen the counterpart for the last 8 years moving in the other direction. It doesn't work very well. There are 12 million people who don't have jobs as a result. It's a little hard to talk about opportunity when you killed the opportunity for 12 million jobs. That's important.
Your view is there an economic case on the distribution of income and mobility, or is it primarily a moral case, fairness
Absolutely,
case?
there's an economic case, and I won't just quote myself and my opinions about this, but I'll quote the IMF, right? I mean, we have got now a series of studies by rather conservative economists who say that our levels of inequality are harming our growth. One thing I just wanted to say, Ron, that's still sort of rattling around in my head is you said that we're sort of betraying our founding principles, where each person can go as far as their talent can take them. And I love this country too much to lie about it. That was not our full founding principle. Our founding principle was also that some people, my ancestors, were not even human. were property. And so I just think we really have to, we can say that so easily and talk about our founding principles and the American dream, and we just have to be very real, and the imperative is so much stronger now, when the promise of our country, which I really believe, is that we can be a fully diverse nation where there's someone here from every community on the globe, and we can make opportunity for them. But we can't lie and say that opportunity was not in fact cabined for all of our history, all the way into the 1980s through redlining, into the 1990s, and 2000s through predatory mortgage lending. So I just want to make sure we're being real.
Well, Jim, do you want to say?
Two quick things. Young people in Ferguson would tell me we're still 3/5 of a person in Ferguson. They know the Constitution, right? That's how they still feel. One young man said, they always ask us what we want. I want an education, I want a job, I want a family. Just what my kids want, right? But in Baltimore, those neighborhoods had left all those kids out of education and jobs and family. So, see, I think, morality, which is my business to talk about, it's not what's right or what's good, it's what's good, but the good has to be the common good. And this is where you're critiquing the government. I understand that point of view. The market has to come in here too. I talked to 2 CEOs last week. These are CEOs who are committed to things like long-term over short-term, stakeholders over just shareholders, purpose over just profits. And they have a common good point of view. They're making lots of money, but they're being assaulted, was the word, by activist investors who want to push all that back and just make a lot of money in the short term for them and have no concern for the legacy of the company, for stakeholders. So they're fighting. There's a big battle going on between, at Davos, a big battle, those who want to see business for the common good and those who just want business for activist investors who seek only their self-interest. So there's a moral issue there. There's also an economic issue there. And I think the two are joined.
David, let me ask you, because you have, as I have, written a lot about the impact of changing demography on institutions in America and politics in America. And as Angela pointed out, by 2018, 2019, a majority of the under 18 population will be non-white. As I said, this was the first year ever where a majority of the K-12 population nationwide, not just Phoenix and Dallas and LA, were kids of color. And maybe most relevant to this conversation, all of the estimates are that between now and 2030, all of the net growth in the workforce will be workers of color, and that not only will the share of whites of working age decline, but the absolute number will decline. There'll be fewer whites of working age in 2030 than there are today. When you add that level of demographic change to the kind of economic stall that we're describing here, how does that change the discussion and the dialogue?
Look, I think very wide open immigration at a time when, for a lot of reasons, the economy is slowing down, makes every problem harder. And to continue or even accelerate the level of immigration, as the administration wants, will make all of those problems harder again, because what the particular immigration that the United States has chosen, because there are other ways to do it, Canada and Australia have done it in different ways, has resulted in a de-skilling of the workforce. The workforce is changing, but as the ETS people have pointed out in a big report they did in 2006, not only will the workforce change demographically by the year 2030, but the average level of skills and even of literacy will be lower in 2030 than it was in the 1990s. And that's going to have a big effect. Now, for the people who are here, you have to find a way to assimilate them. I don't think you want to make the problem necessarily bigger. But I want to pick up on a thing, a question you asked a minute ago, and follow a very important road map or road indicator that Angela pointed us to. What I am concerned about, I'm a conservative-minded person. I'm yes, concerned about justice, and yes, concerned about economic opportunity. I'm concerned about social stability. And probably that's the thing I'm concerned about the most. And it seems that governing elites in the United States, and even more in Europe, have done these experiments over the past decade and a half to say, how much misery can we inflict on how many people before the pillars of society begin to shake? And there has been really amazing social discipline in the United States and in Europe, as when you look at what people have been through, especially in the countries of Southern Europe, where we now have 50% youth unemployment, or at least according to the official statistics in places like Italy and Spain, and yet we haven't had anything like the kind of trouble you might have predicted in advance. I don't think we should take that stability for granted going forward, and we need to give everybody a feeling that, especially those who have the most at stake, We need to give everybody a feeling, I have more at stake in the system than I have to gain from changing the system.
Well, since you brought it up the second time, let's do the immigration discussion now. Is there, Grover, maybe Angela, I mean, each of you have looked at this from different sides. Do you agree that the level of legal immigration included, as well as undocumented immigration, has depressed opportunities for lower skill, lower wage American-born workers?
I don't think so. And I think that the data suggests that while there may be small impacts, that for the most part, it is not. That part of the problem that we have when we talk about people not having skills and not having education is that we do not have an education system that educates people who need it the most. So we have all these people entering the workforce without the education that they need. We need to have a strong educational system, and it needs to be open to all. We also need to make sure that we are really investing in the skills that people need. I'll just give a piece of data that might make your point, but I'm using it to make mine. That that's right.
Share.
That by the time we get to just a couple of years from now, 2017, 47% of the jobs are going to require at least an associate's degree. And yet only 28% of African Americans, 27% of Latinos, 15% of foreign-born Latinos have it. That says that we need to really increase the skills that people have so they'll be ready for the jobs that are there. I also think, just to pick up on what you were saying in terms of social stability, I'd rather tell a good story so that people can embrace a positive future than frighten people. You can go either way. You can say, if we don't get on this right away, there will just be hell to pay. Or you can say, if we get on this right away, in the right way, we will be a nation that is fully inclusive, that we can be proud of, where everybody's going to be able to reach their full potential. Let's try to play to our best instincts and not try to keep fanning this fear. This fear is just the thing that is not helping us at all.
Grover, you're seeing more of a debate in the Republican Party in this election than in many about the value of legal immigration, with Rick Santorum and Scott Walker to some extent, and Mike Huckabee on H-1B visas. What is your take on what David was saying, that this has been part of the problem in terms of slowing mobility and income growth?
No, I don't think so. Look, we need, what makes the United States successful was, one, we started out paying 1.5% in taxes when we were formed before the British left, but also we were open on immigration. People coming here people are an asset, they're not a liability. They bring talent, they work. When some people, and I think if you look at the states, both on education and on how they treat immigrants, Arizona said, oh, we're going to kick them all out, and 400,000 left. Didn't help the economy. People didn't pick up those jobs. They didn't rent those empty apartments, and they pulled the same trick in Alabama and Georgia, scaring away farm workers, and guess what? They couldn't even get prisoners to do this for them, because prisoners just soon go back to prison. And there was, so this idea that some of these people are taking jobs away from other people is counterfactual. When they disappear, there's not some job that shows up. People create jobs through their work, they're not printed somewhere. But one second, because education came up. Education used to be the ticket into the middle class prior to, frankly, the unionization of teachers. And when we're trying to reform education, and we've still got rubber rooms and we're paying people, and you get tenure after a year and a half in California, we at least won a court case that our Supreme Court heroes managed there, which said this is a crime against the kids of California to have tenure laws where teachers that clearly are not doing a good job teaching keep the job and frankly get moved into neighborhoods. And if one of the things they presented in court was, you put a kid in with a bad teacher for a year, he has real problems. You do 2 years, they almost never recover. They are destroying the opportunity for a lot of people of color and not through what the unions have done in not allowing education reform and fighting it. And until that fixes, a lot of this other stuff is talk. And I'm very hopeful that that court case on the abuses of tenure, we shouldn't be paying people in rubber rooms, we shouldn't be giving them pensions, and the unions that defend that are hurting our kids.
Let's talk about, Heather, now we're in the education, which, most people when we talk about inequality, often politicians put most of their chips on the education system. But I want to come at this from a slightly different angle, and feel free as well to respond to what Grover said. You know, I kind of wonder if we are asking too much of those 8 hours a day. We're at a point, you know, we, as I mentioned, we've hit this historic transition where a majority of our K-12 system are now kids of color. We're also approaching a less salutary tipping point where we're almost at a point where a majority of the K-12 public school students are attending schools where a majority of their classmates are poor. And 3/4 of African American kids, 2/3 of Hispanic kids attend schools where a majority of the kids in the school are classified as poor or low income by the federal standards. Is it possible for schools to truly make the dent that we'd all like them to see them make if they are dealing with that level of concentrated poverty?
So yes and no. I never want to give up on the ability for a person to be educated just because their parents are broke. But no, in the sense that we have asked too much of education while resegregating schools, which is what we've done over the course of the past 30 years, and not taking seriously how much place shapes opportunity. So the same neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1970s and 80s and that suffered deindustrialization and white flight are the neighborhoods where there just are not the jobs, there is just not the infrastructure, there is not the lending to be able to create the kind of opportunity that the exact same kid with the exact same hopes, dreams, and IQ would be able to have in a different neighborhood. So I think in terms of the question you asked, Ronald, which I think is really great in terms of, is anyone really talking about solutions that are up to this scale? We need a major, major Marshall Plan in this country for America's communities. And we have a number of different economies that could carry that, whether it's the energy transformation that desperately needs to happen, or the care economy because of the elder boom. We can make targeted investments in communities that have the highest levels of unemployment, upgrading our infrastructure, our human and our physical infrastructure. And the only thing that's missing there is actual elite will. Yeah. Public will is there.
Mike?
It also just concerns me that the data seems to indicate that a lot of that predicts future success takes place before they come to school, children come to school at all. It's really in that ping-pong interaction of parents and children that develop kind of habits of cognitive habits. And those are affected terribly by toxic levels of stress, often brought on by economic conditions. And so I think a lot of what happens in our schools depends on the health of other social institutions that are preliminary. There's no easy program to take care of that. But we are talking about what Putnam calls goodnight moon time, gaps in reading to children, gaps in interaction, even the number of words that a poor child hears per hour compared to a child with whose parents have a graduate degree, for example, is a dramatic difference. And so these are deeply ingrained problems of inequality that start earlier than school.
Before you come in, Angela, let me just follow up with Mike, because you talked before about how rhetoric can become a peg for policy, and the soft bigotry of low expectations became a peg for no child left behind. And whatever people think about it, one key focus of that was saying that schools had to focus on all of their kids.
Disaggregate the data.
Disaggregate the data. And so, but I'm wondering now, as you look back 15 years later, are you also chastened or by the ability of the schools to narrow these gaps, given all the other factors that you're describing? Or do you think school reform can still be a critical lever?
I don't want to give up because some schools do better than other schools in similar social circumstances. And that means we should be studying those examples and trying to duplicate what we can. That doesn't mean that we're going to be able to solve all these deeply rooted social problems, but it means that we can do better in many circumstances. And I view that as kind of the role of conservative reform in this, is to seek incremental changes that improve the lives of children, and that I think we can still do.
Angela?
I just wanted to point out that these deep social problems were created by policy and neglect. And while I read the data and I know what's said about the word gap, I know how important it is to come to school ready to learn, but it bothers me that we are so focused on that which sometimes leads to, so we can't do anything about it. And we can do something about it. Everybody in this room can point to a school or a community someplace where they're making a difference. We need to invest in those things that make a difference, but we need to accept responsibility that if a child is growing up in a toxic environment full of stress because of poverty, because of unemployment, because of absent parents who are incarcerated, because living in concentrated poverty where no one works, if those are the circumstances, they didn't just happen. They happened as a result of policy and neglect. And we have to be as aggressive about correcting that as we are aggressive about understanding the harm that has been done to the child.
David Van Grover.
I think many of the people in this room, and like the young man who introduced this panel, can tell a story about having parents who had very little, maybe they were immigrants to this country, and then you, or like that young man, I think we can see that in his future, through your extraordinary talent and drive and determination, rose to great professional or business success. That is not normal. That is not normal. What is normal is for the accumulation of human capital to take place over multiple generations. 2, 3, and 4. It's slow. And we have to be very realistic about what schools can do. And this is one of the reasons I'm so worried about the immigration choices we make. With the best will in the world, with the best resources, it will still take a couple of generations, or maybe 3 or 4, to take people from very unskilled, uneducated backgrounds and raise them to the educational levels that are required to be successful in a highly developed society. We can't ask the schools to perform miracles. Americans believe in education so much, and they spend so much on it. For a lot of reasons that reflect some of the best things in the American character, some of the best ideals, but also because Americans are doers. And they like measuring things, and they like places where you can spend a lot of money and see a lot of buildings rise and activity taking place and measure it. But as Michael was saying, so much of the most important thing to an individual's life happens in ways that can't be measured outside the school building. So yeah, fine, do more, but don't ask teachers to be miracle workers, and don't blame them when it turns out the average teacher is also, like most of us, pretty average.
We're going to bring in the audience in a minute, but Grover, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, look to the mega issues of economic growth. If we'd had the kind of policies that would have created 12 million additional jobs over the weak recovery, that would have been a lot of change in a lot of neighborhoods, in a lot of lives, and a lot of kids' lives. To set that aside and go, oh no, let's deal with French levels of growth, 2% instead of 4%, because economic policies were made, which gave us 2%, and were predicted to give you 2% instead of 4%. This was not a mistake. This was not a coincidence. This was on purpose. It was a choice.
Which policies are you talking about, Grover?
Well, instead of going with lower taxes, you go with higher taxes, and the massive regulatory burden that had been put on over the last 6 years gave you a slower recovery, the slowest recovery, the worst one since 1960. Not just third best, worst. And 6 million people compared to the average economy are out of jobs today versus 12 million if it had a stronger economy.
After the worst recession.
Look at the longer arc. You had the tax cuts and the low regulation policies, and you had 1.2 million net jobs over 8 years, the worst two-term record of any president since the 20th century. Yes.
Yeah, and you're adding the last 2 years in with the middle 4, which were one policy, and the last 2 years, which were another policy.
So they didn't repeal the tax cuts. I mean, the Congress did not repeal the tax. The tax cuts were in place through the entire Bush presidency.
Tax cuts are not the only one. You don't have the government run Fannie and Freddie. That was a mistake from the beginning, and was going to end this way at some point, and had been predicted for years. I mean, this is a major, and you don't overspend as Bush did, and you don't decide to take all your bandwidth and run Iraq.
Luckily, we've only been arguing about this for 10 years, so it's a little familiar.
Look to the states. Look to the states, because there you can see 50 different approaches to this, including on education reform and on how you handle social welfare spending, and you can see what works and what doesn't.
Jim, make a quick point, and then we want to bring in the audience.
Even the World Bank has shifted its fundamental idea that economic growth solves poverty. Jim Kim says no. Economic growth has to be aimed at overcoming poverty. Growth by itself doesn't, the market by itself doesn't do that. So we've not aimed economic growth at the kids who've been left behind. We've not done that. We've not aimed our educational reform at those kids. There are schools in the toughest neighborhoods that are working because they start early and they go long. It's relationship, but that takes focus intentionality and relation, and we don't do that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I got to say, we wouldn't accept the kind of education that happens to those kids in urban schools. We wouldn't accept that if they were white kids.
If we weren't
just
going to go
wouldn't
to the audience right now, we would allow you to talk about the research you've done in San Francisco, your group, showing how even really robust growth, in some cases, does not penetrate all of the community. Houston has created the most jobs in the country since 2000 by far, and the poverty rate's above the national average. And it's certainly
and it's certainly true in San Francisco.
Yes. Oh, over here.
I would like to address this to Mr. Norquist. In 1978, when you became executive director of the National Taxpayers Union, the top 1% earned 8.2% of national income. Today, they earn 24.6%. How am I not to see that your 40-year lowering taxes on the upper class isn't responsible for this inequality that we're talking about?
Okay, well, you start with 1978. You actually had the bipartisan agreement to do something on capital gains, which was a little bit helpful. But I would argue that we haven't had as much economic growth as we need to. We certainly have been overspending throughout that entire period, Republicans and Democrats alike. And when you do that, and when you have faults, one of the big challenges that lower income people have is the inability to save. And the government comes in and says, we're going to pretend to save for you on Social Security. We're going to take 15% of your income, but we're not actually going to save it. We're going to do a pay-as-you-go system, and people don't accumulate resources and assets and wealth, and that's one of the reasons that lower income people don't have that opportunity. What they did in Utah, passed a law 3 years ago, all new hires for the government and government work in Utah, cops, firemen, teachers, everyone, has a 401k, 10% of your income goes into it. Here's your salary. You want to leave tomorrow, that's your 401k. You want to stick around for 40 years. It is your asset, and the number of people building up assets, you can look at, Chile did the same thing with the amount of distribution of wealth. Well, your original thing was flattering that I'm in charge of economic policy for the last 30 years, but unfortunately, I often talk to people and they don't get it. And we've had backward movement a whole bunch, both on tax rates and on the overall tax burden from progress. So why are we here? Not enough economic growth and not enough opportunity for everybody.
Grover sensitive. Okay, over here.
Jim, I'm interested in your feelings about Kasich and him being a Republican who seems to be doing Matthew 26 sort of. I associate that with your sort of take against the sort of traditional evangelical feeling, but to have a Republican doing what seems to be a more poverty-focused, the widows and the orphans, as a part of his. Can you talk a little bit further about how that fits into the interesting debate that's going on?
If and when he joins the campaign, it's going to be more interesting. Because he's saying things like, as a Catholic, I realize now I'll be judged at the end of my life not for how many elections I win, but how I treat the poor. And he's actually serious about that. So he's engaging in a lot of conversations with people across the aisle about what he's doing in Ohio and what he could do around the country. So Matthew 25 actually is really something he's looking at every day, he tells me. And so I think this...
Can you cite it for all of us?
What is Matthew 25?
That's when Jesus says, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, I was sick, I was a stranger, and what you did to the least of these is what you've done to me. I remember a great story in the Roosevelt table, the president there with all his team, we're there with all our faith leaders about budget cuts and who's bearing the burden of the budget cuts, always the poor. And the Catholic bishop said, Mr. President, we're here at this table because of a text in the Bible that does not say, as you've done to the middle class, you've done to me. It says, as you've done to the least of these, you've done to me. And Obama said, I know that text. So I think whether this is just rhetoric, that at least if the rhetoric is there, it's being aimed at what people feel is the problem. They wouldn't be saying this if they didn't know a lot of people were worried about poverty and inequality. So even if it's lip service for some, it gets the conversation going. But I think among some people on that side of the aisle, it's a serious question about what can I do to solve this. Kasich, I think, is one of those people.
I would only add, there are now several candidates, Republican candidates, who are committed to dramatic expansions in EITC, wage subsidies, which I think would be good policy, and to juvenile justice reform. Those issues now are really on the agenda for Republicans in the next administration. That seems progress, particularly compared to 4 years ago.
Heather, not just talk. Those are passing in states, and if you look at the states where Right on Crime and others have been working over the last several years, started in Texas, by the way, the whole effort at criminal justice reform, where they have successes, and it's been passing in red states.
Heather, we've been talking about the Republican candidates. What's your sense of how Hillary Clinton, as the Democratic frontrunner, will approach these issues and kind of the level of engagement she'll have on them?
So when Secretary Clinton made her announcement, she used a fair amount of language that would suggest that she's going to be squarely focused on this. That makes sense. All of the sort of basic economic policies that were in a progressive contract that Bill de Blasio put out get over 2/3 public approval. The idea that we should have debt-free college for all, the idea that we should have affordable childcare for everyone, the idea that we should have retirement security that is portable and yet also generous is extremely popular on the right and left. So I think, honestly, a lot of people were very surprised about not only was she, sort of talking about a sort of new social contract for the working and middle class, but she was also talking about things like campaign finance reform, which we believe to be an enabler of all of those things, because you really can't break through the grip that the economic elite has on policymaking without it.
I'm going to reserve a little time to ask you a final lightning round kind of question, but let's try to see if we can get one more question in. Yeah.
My name is Hein Karold. I'm Norwegian. And I'd like to ask Mr. Norquist, and maybe other panelists can comment on it. 2 weeks ago or so, President Clinton asked the question of what is wrong with the Norwegian model?
If by Norwegian model you mean having a whole bunch of oil and setting up a fund that way, yeah. Well, if you have that oil, that's kind of cool. The argument being if you're Kuwait, should you give everybody a government job? I don't think it necessarily works very well. And it's been damaging to a lot of petro countries. Nigeria, I mean, make a list of them. They don't do as well as they ought to. They've avoided some of that with Norway, as they did in Alaska, by not spending it all, but by saving it and trying to invest it slower as opposed to
We're going to reserve the Norway debate till after hours. So let's go. One more question over here. Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Sean McIntosh. I'm a U.S. diplomat, and so I see inequality on a much disparate scale. In all the developing countries I've served, there's no middle class. You're either filthy rich or you're dirt poor. So to me, I wonder in the United States, and kind of taking the perspective from foreigners that are looking in, people that want a piece of the American identity that we talked about yesterday, I wonder, are we blowing the inequality argument in the United States out of proportion, and to what degree? Especially given that we have a middle class, an upper and a lower middle class. Thank you.
We're not blowing it out of proportion. It's a huge problem. The United States has been proud of its middle class, and for many people, it has not ever been within reach. A lot of the American people are beginning to understand what that feels like. And at this moment, we need to really show how much of a common agenda we have in terms of being able to create pathways so that people can live with dignity and support their families. That you can take any poor country, and what makes it poor is not that there are no rich people, it's that there's no middle class. This country needs to be concerned about that. It doesn't want to be that place. And I just want to say that I'm really looking forward to the presidential debates, though. I am looking forward to the presidential debates, because if we really start debating inequality and poverty and opportunity, we are finally having a debate that the American people have an opinion on. They understand how it impacts them, and that could be really robust.
Angela, I want to stay right here and then go right down the line in our last 3 minutes, and that was a great segue in. If you could do 1 or 2 or 3, but not 10, things to reduce inequality and expand opportunity, what would be on the very top of your list that you would want the next president to pursue?
I would really raise the national minimum wage so that people who go to work every day do not have to live in poverty. I would make sure that we stop talking K-12 and we start preschool through 14 or college education, because that's what's needed. And I would make sure that we have the protections that we need for people who fall out of work and other things. It is not a country that you can be proud of when poor people fall and there's no safety net.
My top concern, as I've said a number of times in this discussion, is what is happening not to the extraordinary person who has the misfortune to be born at the bottom and who hopes to rise, but to the ordinary person who may be born somewhere below the middle and who just wants to keep doing something that they like to do and wants to see that, as happened in the years after World War II, that you can do the same thing and be better off at the end of 30 years by working consistently. Changes in the global economy may make that very difficult. So when you say, what is my one thing? I think at least removing some of the great concerns that middle-class people have, of which the overriding one has been the risk of bankruptcy from healthcare costs. I'm a Republican. I did not support Obamacare, but I welcome some form of universal healthcare guarantee. Finance, not the way Obamacare is financed with redistributive taxes, financed broadly, without a lot of the burdensome regulation, but at least alleviating this terrible fear for middle-class people, enhancing social stability that way.
Adding to what Angela said, I would do 2 things. One, have a much more progressive tax system and use that revenue to really facilitate an energy transformation in this country and use targeted universalism to create jobs, including WPA-style government jobs, in order to really accelerate some upward mobility in this country. And then second, I would have Z through 16 education that was truly, truly public.
Z is 0?
Z is 0.
Okay.
Globalization is something we always talk about. If we were to decide to rebuild the infrastructure of this country, at the center of which was a new clean energy grid, you would have jobs and good jobs for generations to come. And if we educated our whole new generation for those kinds of things, we'd have a whole new circumstance.
I think we're going to need some redistribution, but of a certain kind. Redistribution that rewards work, which is, I think, wage subsidies like EATC are very important. They're actually much better at doing what they do than the minimum wage, which goes to a lot of people who aren't poor. I think we need to encourage skills. That's access to higher education and making sure people graduate. And I think we need to reward family. And so I think family tax credit should be on the table to really allow people to take care of their own.
Stop doing damage. We need to take a look at the education system and not run it for the teachers union, but run it for the kids. We need to have parents have actual choice. We need to have more charter schools, regardless of what the mayor of New York thinks, trying to close them down. We need to have more school choice. The first thing Obama did when he came in was to kill school choice for 3,000 black poor kids because the teachers union told them to. We need politicians who don't listen to the teachers unions and listen to parents and kids. And we need to go out into people trying to get a job, trying to get to move up and say, we're not going to have 30% of the jobs have some government, well, you can't do that, designed by the industry itself because people don't want more taxi drivers, or they don't want more people mowing lawns, or they don't want more people braiding hair. Those kind of closing doors to the least among us, the people trying to get a job for the first time who don't have any income now and hope to, that has to end. That has to be dramatically reduced. Back in the 1950s, 60s, when 5% had licenses, somehow the world worked pretty well and people were able to start up and get jobs. We need to stop with those barriers, and we need to not demonize immigrants.
And I would add, thank you, I would add one other thought, which is that we need ultimately, I think, if we're going to deal with this, to rebalance our public priorities somewhat from past to future. In 1969, 1/3 of the budget was classified as investment in the future. 1/3 was payment to individuals. Today, payment to individuals is up to 62%. Investment in the future is down to 16%. And ultimately, our political challenge is convincing a 80% white baby boom that is moving right that it has a stake in the success of this increasingly diverse Next America, as we call it at National Journal. And that, I think, is that building that bridge is one of the fundamental challenges that we face in the 21st century. But with all of that, you guys have been an incredible panel. Would you join me in thanking them? Yes. Yes.